Hey everyone, this is Crazy Cat Lady. In my last video, I mentioned I would create a video on the FBI profile of family annihilators as it pertains to Chris Watts. Briefly, the FBI profile identifies two main types: revenge annihilators, which is the topic of this video, and altruistic annihilators. Then four subtypes: sonomic, in other words economic, self-righteous, disappointed, and paranoid annihilators. I am convinced Chris Watts killed his family as a matter of revenge, and that is the secret Chris Watts and his family are trying to hide. I will be quoting from an article I found in PDF format for easy download titled Deadly Dads: Men Who Murder Their Children by Belinda Morris. Although this article deals primarily with men who kill their children only as an act of revenge against their mother, I believe the article aptly describes Chris Watts as well. It is possible, after all, that Shannan came home from her business trip to find her children dead, and Chris killed her after she witnessed the fact that he'd murdered them. The article I'm going to quote from explains family annihilation as an act of revenge in detail. I will also explain in this video the so-called mitigating factors his family and friends are trying to promote, and I will refute them. So I'll begin with a quote from Morris's article. Quote, "Society wants to believe there are mitigating factors in these murders. Men are presented as finding themselves at a dead end, having no other choice, and as acting because they are coerced by circumstances." End quote. This is exactly what the Watts camp, as they define themselves, would have us believe. But that is not what the record shows. Historically, family annihilators were placed into two categories: revenge killers or altruistic killers. First, I will discuss altruistic killers, and then revenge killers. Chris Watts is a revenge killer. The FBI later expanded on these two types to include four others, which I will only touch upon in this video. First, I want to discuss the two historical types: revenge killers and altruistic killers. An example of an altruistic killer would be a man who is the sole breadwinner, loses his job, and kills his family to spare them a life of poverty. One example I can think of is the murder of Georgia Senator Nancy Schaefer, murdered by her husband Bruce, who then killed himself in 2010. Though not exactly a family annihilation, the altruistic motive was there. Nancy was an advocate for Child Protective Service reform, and many people hoped and believed she would bring about much-needed family court reform. But her house was going into foreclosure, so Nancy's husband murdered her to spare her the humiliation of foreclosure, then turned the gun on himself. This was a tragic event, not just for Nancy, but for thousands of people in the family court system who had successfully gained her attention for much-needed help. Many altruistic killers also kill themselves, and many of them believe they will be reunited with their families in the afterlife. The categories can overlap. John Liss, an accountant from New Jersey who killed his entire family in 1971, then escaped law enforcement for 18 years, may fit into multiple categories: the altruistic, sonomic, and self-righteous types. He believed his family had strayed far away from his religious beliefs. His wife was an alcoholic who mocked and scorned him because he was only able to provide his family of five with TV dinners. His children were teenagers who didn't want to go to church on Sundays. Interestingly, the dead bodies were found after a month in an air-conditioned home, well lit with classical music playing, resembling a funeral parlor. This suggests he believed the family would be reunited in the afterlife. Now we'll discuss revenge killers and the Chris Watts case. Anyone attempting to mitigate the reasons Chris murdered his family has a bad case of misplaced sympathy. In my last video, I mentioned idiot compassion. The only people who can legitimately empathize with a family annihilator are other family annihilators. For instance, Chris Watts has empathy for Jake Patterson, who is housed in the cell next to him. Jake Patterson is the young man who kidnapped and raped 13-year-old Jamie Kloss after first murdering her parents. Chris Watts empathizes with Jake Patterson because he's young and Chris wants to share the Bible with him. Needless to say, murderers empathize with other murderers in prison. Revenge killings must be weighed against their so-called mitigating factors, but first I want to read a few more quotes from Belinda Morris's article, Deadly Dads. Quote, Dr. Vince Agan, a forensic psychology lecturer, asserts, these men are thinking, how do I get back at somebody if I cannot otherwise upset them because they care so little about me? Unquote. Chris Watts did in fact believe that Shannan did not care much for him, as I will discuss shortly. Here's another quote from the article. Quote, Professor Jack Levin at Northeastern University in Boston, who is an expert at this issue, states it clearly. The children are killed because the husband blames the wife and everything associated with her. End quote. In the same article, Miriam Stoppard explains, quote, the man now hates his wife so much that he will do anything to stop her. End quote. The reason Chris Watts killed his wife and children is because he hated Shannan and everything associated with her. The affair with Nicole Kessinger was only the tipping point in escalating divorce procedure. He long ago realized that divorce was inevitable, that Shannan would probably be the winner, so to speak, in a final divorce, and that he would be tangled up in family court litigation for child support for a minimum of 18 years because of Shannan's pregnancy with Nico. I'd like to interject that 18 years is a very long time to be tangled up in litigation, and this is precisely where family court is in dire need of reform. Before I move on to the so-called mitigating factors offered by the Watts camp, I'd like to discuss author Kathleen Houston a little bit. Now, I may be wrong about her name. I think it is Kathleen Houston or close to it. Anyhow, she is working with the Watts family to, quote-unquote, find answers to unanswered questions. The first chapter, a rough draft, has been read online on YouTube with disastrous results when she asks the rhetorical question, did Chris Watts murder his family to hide the family secret that Shannan was hurting the children, presumably due to Munchausen syndrome? The point she makes that people murder to hide a secret is a good point, but the rough draft of the first chapter has flaws that outweigh the merits of this point. First of all, it is basic college education that asking rhetorical questions is not the same thing as answering them, and the job of an author is to inform the reader, not pose rhetorical questions. Secondly, Miss Houston needs to do a lot more homework, or even just a little more homework, because the answers to those rhetorical questions are already answered by those with advanced education in criminology, etc. The answers to those questions are answered in this one solitary article I am quoting from, written by Belinda Morris. Chris Watts murdered his family for revenge. Here is another quote from the article. As with other men who abuse their partners and children, killer fathers rarely accept responsibility for their actions. They never feel like villains, they feel like victims. She is the villain, and the annihilation is sweet revenge. How despicable. How can anyone empathize with Chris Watts? So that being my position, and incidentally, an author needs to assume a position, and Houston's position is quite shaky, I will move on to the so-called mitigating factors floating around on YouTube about this case and refute them if I can, or just point them out so others can. First and foremost is the assertion that Shannan once kicked Chris out of the house. He claims he had to do a lot of begging to get back in the house, and he never contradicted Shannan after that. He claims in his first confession that he felt like he couldn't even hang a picture on the wall without asking permission, that he was walking on eggshells, and he felt relieved when she left for North Carolina for a 6-week vacation. Incidentally, he told his friend Dave that this was a trial separation. Dave is a neighbor and friend of Chris Watts, who wrote to Chris while he was in jail and asked to be put on his visitors list. This fact is in the discovery. Chris told author Sherilyn Cadle that he felt emasculated. Okay, so let's unpack all that. I have not yet been able to locate a date where Chris specifies that Shannan kicked him out of the house, but let's assume this is true, although it may not be true. A marriage should be based on equity, and absent domestic violence, neither party really has a legal right to kick each other out of the house. If it is true that Shannan once kicked Chris out of the house without the legal right to do so, this may have been a power play that Shannan was never able to live down in Chris's mind, no matter how hard she tried. This may have been the origins of Chris's perception of emasculation. For those who are unclear as to what exactly emasculation is, it is to deprive a man of his rightful role. If this assertion is true, I have to wonder why the police were not involved. Chris should have asserted his quote-unquote masculinity by invoking his legal right to remain in the home and called the police. If true, I believe this is where the marriage began to fall apart irreparably. Chris went into a slow-boiling rage, and killing Shannan and the children was the ultimate demonstration of his newfound masculinity due to his affair with Kessinger. But this emasculation he speaks of very much appears to have been a pre-existing condition prior to his marriage. He was a nerd. He even speaks like Kermit the Frog. Marriage had transformed him. So here's another quote by author Morris from aforementioned Professor Levin. Quote, "These are executions. They are never spontaneous. They are well planned and selective. They are not carried out in the heat of the moment or in a fit of rage. They are very methodical, and it is often planned out for a very long time. There are certain people the killer blames for his problems. If a friend came along, he wouldn't kill him or her. He kills his children to get even with his wife because he blames her and he hates her. The killer feels he has lost control. It is a methodical, selective murder by a rational, loving father. That's why it is so terrifying." End quote. The bizarre picture of the doll looking like a morgue picture that Chris sent to Shannan seems like a forewarning, and many of us believe that it was a forewarning of what was to come. Perhaps Shannan came home from her business trip to find 2 dead children that Chris wanted her to see. Maybe she fainted in horror, making it easier for Chris to kill her. None of us know what happened in those 3.5 short hours between the time that Shannan got home and Chris left for work. Chris keeps changing his story, and so does Cindy Watts. Whatever the case, kicking him out of the house, if that is true, cannot be a solid mitigating factor because Chris had the option to call law enforcement. Had he called law enforcement, he could have obtained some equity, although, in truth, that also might have signaled the beginning of the end of their marriage. Kessinger had given him the key to her apartment. By the time he met Kessinger, he stated that his credit was so maxed out he could not afford his own apartment. If Kessinger was not comfortable with him moving in to facilitate the separation from Shannan, it is pretty certain he could have moved back in with his parents. But then he couldn't have been with Kessinger, and he would also lose a good job at Andarko. At any rate, both parties, Shannan and Chris, had families that would have supported them during divorce. And this is how it should have gone instead of murdering everyone. Not everyone has supportive families, leaving them nowhere to turn when they are unhappy in a marriage. In the Watts case, separation and divorce would have been difficult, but not impossible. Kicking Chris out of the house seems to me to be the primary motive for revenge. But there are other factors that indicate divorce was looming on the horizon. So, second on my list of so-called mitigating factors on YouTube is the fact that Chris was an introvert and Shannan was an extrovert, and they were incompatible, as Chris himself states. I don't disagree with this. But as I mentioned earlier, Chris was somewhat of a nerd who, through working out, transformed his image into a well-dressed man with sex appeal. Shannan had, quote-unquote, groomed him, as spouses often do. He claims that he was always the one who had to initiate sex with Shannan, and that Nicole Kessinger was the first woman who ever pursued him instead of the other way around. He does not see the irony in the fact that his wife groomed him only for another woman to be attracted to him and pursue him. Third on my list of so-called mitigating factors are the financial troubles the Watts faced. Now, I'm going to make a serious point at the end of this. The beginning of these two paragraphs are pretty mundane. Shannan made about the same amount of money as Chris did. An in-depth financial analysis can be found on a channel I watch called 411 Now. Shout out to 411 Now. Many claim that multi-level marketing companies are scams, and Shannan could not possibly be earning as much money as she was spending. But apparently she was. It is likely that their credit card troubles were the end result of accumulated interest, so that minimum payments were only applied toward the principal. So that minimum payments were only applied toward interest. If this was the case, they could have and should have turned their debts over to a debt management company so they could at least reduce their interest rates and avoid a second bankruptcy. Many of their debts were the result of medical bills. Some people have cruelly tried to suggest Shannan had Munchausen's and Munchausen's by proxy, that she supposedly had both of them, and this caused the medical expenses. But here's the kicker. The real purpose of trying to imply Shannan had Munchausen's is to suggest it was a mitigating factor on the level of the infamous Gypsy Rose case. Gypsy Rose is a young woman who conspired with her boyfriend to murder Gypsy's mother because Gypsy's mother did in fact have Munchausen's and was medically abusing Gypsy. Gypsy and her boyfriend went to prison, but Gypsy's prison time was mitigated by her mother's medical abuse, and her sentence was reduced. So this is the main point. That's the main point I wish to make regarding the Watts finances. And as I said, a more in-depth analysis can be found at the aforementioned YouTube channel 411 Now for those who are interested. The last and final so-called mitigating factor offered by YouTube commentators is the most obvious one. That he wanted out of the marriage, and Shannan would have been entitled to a hefty divorce settlement, perhaps even more so if the fact that he was having an affair with Kessinger came out into the open, depending on Colorado divorce laws, and depending on if Shannan ever found out that he was having an affair and who he was having an affair with. Quoting again from Belinda Morris's article, quote, "A common feature amongst child murderers is preemptive revenge, against a wife who might be planning to request a large divorce settlement, end quote. Family court reform is necessary for many reasons, but two of the biggest reasons is that, first, the current system of tangling a spouse into constant litigation for 18 years, more or less, is unacceptable, and it's costing many lives besides. Second, there does not appear to be an acceptable alternative to prevent people from having to air their dirty laundry in public court during a divorce. The court demands it, and this is utterly traumatic for people who have made the mistake of falling in love with the wrong person. So, this concludes my video on the Watts family annihilation and revenge. Thank you for listening. Please bear with me as I learn how to incorporate images and etc. into my videos. Please hit like and subscribe. Thank you.